that's I am very much impressed. See, every workshop is not like that. Your intention is very good, madam. And I have read about her through her website. Those who are interested can go through and search. And many will be interested to join her high-end workshops. Other day when I was talking with her, she said that मैंने उनको बताया कि ये तो आपका जो वर्कशॉप है बहुत कॉस्टली है, इट इज नॉट मतलब एवरी कांट एफर्ट. तो उन्होंने बोला कि सिर्फ पैसा ही नहीं है, हेल्थ भी अच्छा होना चाहिए. तो दोनों पैसा एंड हेल्थ दोनों जिसका साउंड है, दे कैन जॉइन हर वर्कशॉप. एंड मैं एक्चुअली शायद आई होप फाइनेंशियली, ऐसे तो हेल्थ तो हूँ, हेल्थी तो हूँ, फाइनेंशियली कभी अगर एफर्ट कर सकता हूँ तो ज्वाइन करूंगा. एंड आप उनका काम देखिए एंड यू डिसाइड. ऐसे इंडिया में भी बहुत कुछ इतना लैंडस्केप का मतलब गिफ्टेड अपने पास ब्यूटी है, तो वी कैन एक्सप्लोर. तो उनका काम देख के हम लोग बहुत कुछ इंस्पिरेशन ले लेंगे एंड वी विल एबल टू लर्न मेनी थिंग्स फ्रॉम हर एंड शी विल गेट इंस्पायर्ड फ्रॉम डॉक्टर सपना रेड्डी. एंड सपना रेड्डी जी को मैं पूरा फ्लोर ऑफर करता हूँ. Doctor, please, floor is yours.
Namaste, everyone. Thank you so much to the Photographic Society of India for giving me this opportunity to speak. It's a real honor.
Recording in progress.
Congratulations on completing 25 years. 35. Okay, that's awesome. How many? I'm sorry?
85.
Oh my goodness. 85. And it was a cottonwood tree, and somehow the subject wasn't coming together at all. The light wasn't working. There were too many distractions around it, and then finally got frustrated with it and said, it's not working. Let me just go back. So he was in the northern part of New Mexico, and he started driving towards Santa Fe. And as he was going on the road, he realized that it was going to be full moon that night. And so he knew the moon would be coming up somewhere. He didn't know how he would photograph it, but he knew that it was going to be an interesting picture. Then as he was driving, he came to this little town, which is called Hernandez, and he saw a cemetery in front of this little town. You can see the little crosses there. And then he saw the moon in the sky, the full moon in the sky. What was interesting was just below the moon, there was a bank of low cloud that was being lit by the light of the setting sun. And then, of course, the mountains were also catching a little bit of light. When he saw this scene, he absolutely wanted to photograph it. So he stopped the car, he jumped out, he grabbed his gear, he ran towards where he could set up his tripod. And, in those days, back in 1941, a few years after the Photographic Society of India was created, there was not much photography. The gear was very heavy, right? And it cumbersome. And it's not like the digital cameras we have today. So even to take one shot, it takes quite a bit of effort. So he was trying to set it up, and then he realized that he did not have his light meter with him. So he did not know, how long to expose the frame for. And then he did some mental calculations. He thought, oh, the moon is going to be 250 lumens. So this is how I should expose. And he was shouting to his 7-year-old son to grab this, grab that. And the poor boy was confused as well. Anyway, with all of the confusion and effort, he managed to take one picture. This was the picture. That's all he had the time for. And then before you know it, the sun set, the light on the clouds disappeared, and the picture was gone. So he had one frame that he could make, and he made it on November 14th, 1941. This picture actually pretty much launched his entire career. And I find that very interesting because for all those people who proudly say, this picture is straight from the camera, I want you to look at this image very, very carefully, because what Ansel Adams actually shot was, oh, I wanted to go to the next one. Let's see. It doesn't want to move to the next image for me. I'm going to stop sharing and try again. Go back. Okay, let's try this. So you see that? Let's see if I can go back and forth. Okay, for some reason, it's not letting me go back and forth, but so I'm going to keep it here. I hope that's okay. If I do, so it'll let me scroll this way, but it's not. So this is the original picture. See how the sky is darkened and the moon is bright and the clouds are bright. And then this, my computer is acting up for some reason. And that was the original picture. So what did Ansel do in going from this picture to the other picture that I showed you? Why did he process it that way? Because when we are presenting an image, we choose how the viewer's eye should travel through the image. So for Ansel, what was important in this image was the moon, the light on the clouds, and the light on the crosses in the cemetery. If you look at this image and you consciously ask yourself, how is my eye traveling through the image, right? It goes all over the place really, because everything is kind of gray, muted tones. You're not really directing your eye at once to the moon. Whereas in the other image that I showed you before, let me try to rectify this. Why is it doing that? I'm going to stop sharing and try to fix this. 1 second. Sorry about that. Need to launch it again. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So in going from this to this image, basically what he did, let's make this bigger so you can see it. Basically what he did is, I want the viewer's eye to go pinpoint to the moon. So what am I going to do? I'm going to darken the sky, because why? The eye will travel to the point of brightness, to the point of maximal contrast. So now, basically Ansel Adams, it took him 30 years to process this image because he had a certain creative vision and he was like, this is how I'm going to dodge and burn it. And remember, all that we're doing here in post-processing is dodging and burning. But when you look at this image, where does your eye go, right? There is no doubt that it goes to the moon. This is a story about moonrise over Hernandez. And by blackening the sky, by burning it, he basically directed the viewer's eye. Once you see the moon, you have a stronger emotional response to it. And that's how you modulate the viewer's response. This was the previous one, and this is the processed one. So you see, even back 80 years ago, people were still post-processing images. Nobody was throwing things out of the camera and claiming to be proud about the fact. You don't want to do that because the camera is just a tool, just like the post-processing we do is also a tool. So in order to fulfill the creative vision of the photographer, how you process the image after acquisition is as important as the acquisition in the field itself. That's the point I would like to convey. Moving on. So what is creative vision, right? What you bring to the landscape is as important as what the landscape brings to you. So I love this quote by Ansel Adams, which says, You don't make a photograph just with a camera. You bring to the act of photography all the pictures you have seen, the books you have read, the music you have heard, the people you have loved. In essence, you have to pour a piece of yourself into the image. And that's how you make it a much more powerful and impactful image. And even more importantly, something that is unique to your style, only you. No one else in the world, only you can generate that image because it has your personality in it. If you just take the camera and shoot it in the field, sure, your perspective of the scene, what you choose to photograph, how you photograph it does have an impact. But if we don't post-process it, then we're not really pouring ourselves into the image and taking our creative vision to fruition. Okay, so we talked about the first point of observation. Let's talk about focused observation, which is with mindfulness, which is with purpose, and which is with the idea that there will be a specific moment in time when we must click the shutter, and that is when we get the most powerful image. I want to tell you another story now. This is with another very famous photographer, Galen Rowell, also based in California, just like Ansel Adams, you know, and every time I go to Yosemite and I stand there, I remember the time when Ansel Adams stood there and Galen Rowell stood there long before nature photography was trendy and, you know, long before Instagram was a thing, and created these incredible images that inspired so many hundreds of thousands of us to follow in their footsteps. This is one such story. So this is the story of Horsetail Falls. This is a waterfall that happens intermittently in Yosemite. You probably heard of it as Fire Falls. What happens is for 10 days in the month of February, when there is enough snow on top of the El Capitan mountain and there is enough sunlight, the sunlight melts the snow and water begins to flow down the east buttress of El Capitan. The light of the setting sun hits it only for 10 days at such an angle that it turns the water to the color of lava. So these are images that I took this year of the Horsetail Falls. And what I find interesting is the story behind it. So many years ago, Galen Rowell, who was an avid rock climber, was climbing up the walls and up the granite walls around Yosemite. So he finished his day of climbing, came down, and he was, you know, in his car and he's heading back home. And then suddenly he looks up at El Capitan and notices that this waterfall is coming down and that light is hitting it. So observation, right? He kept his eyes open. He's looking around for photographic opportunities. He sees this happening. He knows that when the sun is setting, this is going to change color. He jumps out of his car and he runs towards this phenomena. He jumps over a couple of fences, grabs his camera, and he runs towards it and he starts photographing it. Now there is a park ranger nearby who notices that he jumped over a couple of fences. And then he looks up at what Galen Rowell is photographing, and he's also mesmerized by what's going on. So instead of penalizing him for breaking the rules, he asks him, what do you want? And Galen Rowell says, could you please get me my tripod from my car? So actually the park ranger takes the tripod to Galen Rowell. Galen Rowell gets the shots. And guess who gives his very first print of Horsetail Falls to? Obviously the park ranger, to say thank you. So that image that he took has inspired so many thousands and thousands of people every year. It's become almost like a pilgrimage, right? People go to Yosemite during those 10 days and stand there and look up at the mountain, hoping to see this phenomena. Now remember, if there are clouds, the light will be blocked and you won't see the waterfall. If there isn't enough snowfall on top of the mountain, then there is nothing to melt. Then the waterfall won't come down. So that all of the factors in nature must align and you must be lucky enough to witness it. But when it happens, it's just an absolutely amazing phenomena. And this year, even though there was a pandemic, we had limited access. So you had to win a lottery to get into Yosemite, you had to get up in the morning and, you know, you had to log on to a site and enter a lottery, and people did that and they showed up. And everybody, you know, was maintaining safe distance because we were in the outdoors and we're looking up at this wonderful thing. And for somebody who was cooped up during the pandemic and then witnessing something like this was obviously spectacular. It just happened to be when we were pretty much hitting our peak of the pandemic. So it was something positive to look at. So it's amazing how nature has the power to make a moment that may otherwise have been quite painful and unbearable to us, just to completely transform it just by being outside and seeing something so wonderful. And I'm always amazed at how different I feel when I spend that time in the outdoors. So I think for each and every one of you who pursues nature photography or wildlife photography, I'm sure that is the driving force. And I wanted to put my own twist on it. So that image you saw earlier, that first one is by Galen Rowell. And then these images, I just wanted to do something a little bit different. So that last image, which I'm not sure if I can move this a little bit. So yeah, so you can see that. So that last image, I tried to make it more like an artifact, abstract. So you can see the quality of the rock and really appreciate how it really looks like lava, doesn't it? Like flowing down. Okay, so moving on. Okay. So the most important thing is to be aware of light and notice how it is changing, because the light will direct where we're going to photograph. Right? We cannot have any preconceived notions. And I love this quote by Elliot Erwitt, which says, all the technique in the world does not compensate for the inability to notice. So if we cannot notice, even if you are an expert at handling your gear, you know all the workings of the camera, you know the sharpest point of the lens and everything, the primary awareness must be of light. Without that, all of the technical expertise is an absolute waste. Sure, you will be able to generate an image which may be technically correct, but you will not have an emotionally impactful image. So let's talk a little bit about that reaction. What is the emotional connection that we're talking about to a scene? So this is a forest in Northern California. It's the National Redwood Forest, and I go to it every year. I absolutely love this forest because the fog and mist come flowing through the forest and give it a very ethereal, dream-like feeling. And of course, for somebody who's trying to generate images that have a healing effect, this is perfect, right? Because green is very therapeutic. So establishing an emotional connection means that you want to identify key visual elements of interest in the scene. So think of it like, okay, we're going to have a play. We're going to enact a play, a drama. And then we're going to pick the main characters for the drama. So think of the photograph as a visual story or a visual play or a visual drama. Who are the main characters in that story? Once you approach the photograph like that, then you ask yourself, is it going to be this tree? Is it going to be this fern? Is it going to be this pathway? So that way, instead of using words, we are using our images to convey the story. So I was going down this path in the Redwood Forest, and the fog kept getting thicker and thicker to the point where I couldn't even see the trees in front of me. My plan was to hike down towards the coast where the trees start to get a little bit bigger as you go down this trail. But realizing that, you know what, I'm observing the fog and it's going to make everything white. I can't photograph here, reacting to it and saying, let me come back from there, get above that fog and see if I can find a picture. And then coming upon these trees and realizing that this is the scene that needs to be photographed, right? Because why? I feel a very strong emotional connection to what is happening here. First of all, these trees are hundreds, if not thousands of years old. They're extremely tall. They're like skyscraper buildings. And then they are surrounded by fog, which gives it a very ethereal atmosphere. And to top it off, we have the sun that is breaking through that fog and giving off these God beams. So for me, I felt like I was having a spiritual connection with a superior being on seeing the same. I fell to my knees and started photographing it. I wanted to accentuate the height of the trees and also make us realize how small we are in this big cosmos, right? In the presence of nature, we are such tiny elements. This forest has stood there for thousands of years. Thousands of individuals like me have come and gone, and these trees have stood witness to that time. And when I saw the light coming through that, it told me a story. It told me, like, there is hope. Even in the darkest of forests, there is hope. So this is the visual story behind it. So there is more to a photograph than just the visual elements in it. This is not a photograph of two trees. It is the photograph of a sentiment that I'm trying to express of hope. So we'll come back to that and discuss that a little bit more about how to convey emotion through the photographs. But most importantly, at this point, I just want to say, if I don't feel a connection to what I'm photographing, then the image I generate will not have an emotional connection with the viewer. That's the point I wanted to make. Okay, so we as photographers want to captivate our audience. We want to create images that are very powerful, very emotionally impactful. How do we do that? What are the tools we have at our disposal? Well, all through evolution, the human eye has been trained to pay attention to certain things, right? When you're presented with a big scene, you automatically pick out the things that are most important in the scene. For example, if you're standing in a field and then suddenly you see stripes, then you say, your mind picks out just the stripes. It doesn't have to see the full tiger, but your mind will know that there is a tiger in the grass over there. Why? Because that is a survival skill, right? We have to be able to identify danger. So even when we see a small part of something, the mind actually translates the whole thing and tells you those stripes represent an animal that could be potentially dangerous for you. So our mind has evolved to train our eyes to catch things that are important to us, whether that is to alert us towards danger, or maybe it is like a red apple, right? And you're like, oh, that is food. That is something that is important for me. So we can capitalize on that evolutionary process and say, well, we know that our eye is automatically drawn to areas of brightness, to areas of increased contrast, to areas of increased color and increased texture. So I can use these four elements to modulate where the viewer's eye travels through the frame. Why is dodging and burning so important in a picture? Because you want to carve out the visual pathway in which the viewer's eye will travel. Why? Because when you can modulate where the viewer looks, you can control their attention span and you can control the emotional response they will have to the image. So for example, in this image, we have an area that is really bright in the background, right? Light streaming across the layers of mountains. Then we have a point of sharp contrast where a photographer is standing on a ledge and looking at the light. So when you ask yourself, how is my eye traveling through this frame? It will go from the photographer to what he's looking at, the light. Then from the light, it will come back to the photographer. So our eyes will bounce back and forth, and in doing so, investing our attention in the frame. The fact that the clouds on top have been darkened a little, deliberate. The fact that the bottom has been burned a little, deliberate. What's on the sides has also been burnt a little, deliberate. Why? Because I want the viewer to only focus on the light and the photographer. It's a story about that, right? So I have used brightness, contrast, color, and texture all to achieve that response. And that's something I want each and every one of you to consciously start thinking about in your image and ask yourself, where do I want the viewer to look and how am I going to make sure that he looks just there? Remember what Ansel Adams did with that moon? He wanted people to look at that moon, right? So what did he do? He blackened the sky so that you would stare at the moon. Why? Because it would pop out. Why? Because it was a bright spot with the sharpest contrast. So there is a logical analysis to what we do in post-processing to modulate that visual pathway. And it's very important to step back and address that. So the next time you see an image and you say, oh my God, I love this image, ask yourself why. What did the photographer do that is forcing me to get attracted to this image? And analyze it with these 4 elements and say, how were these 4 elements used in that image? And in doing so, you can practice to do the same to your own images down the road. Okay, one of the biggest problems we face when we are trying to, and please, Narayanji, if there are any questions, please feel free to jump in and interrupt me at any time.
Question, only appreciation, brilliant capture.
Thank
One
you.
thing I want to ask the doctor, the photographer here standing there, how you are able to, was there somebody with you, or you yourself, it is a self-portrait?
No, that is actually during a trip in Alaska, which was a heli hiking trip. So some of us got dropped off by a helicopter in the middle of absolutely nowhere. We just flew over the area, and you know, anything we found interesting, we asked the helicopter pilot to just drop us off there. And we had our tents and our food and our supplies. And the helicopter pilot would come back after 3 or 4 days while we explored that area. There was nobody around for hundreds of miles. This is in the middle of absolutely nowhere in the Alaskan wilderness. And it so happened that I was up high for this picture. I was up high on a different level where my tent was. I had camped there. And then this photographer had just walked down to get a closer look at the water that was below. So when I got up and looked outside the tent and saw him and saw the light, I realized there was a photograph to be made. This is not planned. I had no idea the light would come between the mountains like that. I did not know the photographer would step into the frame. But I think just being aware of observation, right? Being able to see, okay, where is the light? And then saying, wait, this human element adds such a beautiful scale to the image, and then capturing it that way. I think without the human being there, the emotional connection would not be as strong, because 1, I would not be able to demonstrate scale as well. And 2, somehow having a person in the picture looking at the scene makes the viewer feel, hey, I could be that person. And so it evokes a stronger emotional response. So I like to incorporate human beings in nature whenever possible. Just got lucky with this one, that this person stood there and stared long enough for me to make that exposure. But yeah, completely fortuitous.
I have seen
not planned
using human element in most of your landscapes wherever it's possible, and very perfectly, very effectively.
Yeah, it makes a big difference, I think, to have a human being there, because again, it makes a viewer feel like I could be that person. You know, it's possible for me to be standing there. That's a very strong reaction to have. Moving on. Okay, so one of the most difficult things we face is, let's say we go to the beach. And Naranji, I tend to talk a lot. So you'll have to tell me when we are at a half time or whatever, because I just talk too much, I think. So please let me know if I'm running out of time. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about, let's say we go to the beach, right? And we're standing on the beach. You can feel the sand beneath your feet. Yes. You can feel the wind playing with your hair. You can smell the salt in the sea, right? The smell of the sea. And then you have the entire 360-degree view before you of the ocean. So you are using 5 senses to take in the experience of what is before you. But as photographers, what are we trying to do? We have only one sense, the visual sense. We are trying to convey an experience we had with all 5 senses and condense it to one sense, only the visual, only a 2D frame, and say, let's make the viewer feel the way I felt when I was standing at the scene. Can you imagine how difficult that is? What a tall order, right? How arrogant are we to think that we will compensate for all the other 4 senses by using just the visual sense? You can imagine how much we would have to invest in creating that image if we want to have the same kind of emotional experience we had when we were standing at that scene. So one of the most difficult things to achieve is depth, right? Because we went from a 3D experience to a 2D image. Then how do we bring back the depth? How do we make the viewer feel like, hey, I'm still looking at a 3D scene? There are actually certain specific steps we can take to add depth to an image. And that is where I would like you to understand the concept of transitions. So you see, when we look at something, when we look at a big scene, what is closer to us tends to be in sharper focus. Because it's near us, we can see it much better. What is farther away tends to be faded out a little bit, softer in focus, right? Not as textured, not as contrasty. And so our eyes, when they see that, say, hey, this object, which I'm seeing very clearly, is close to me. That object, which I'm not seeing so clear, is farther from me. And by analyzing it in that fashion, our eyes are able to pick up that concept of depth. So we can capitalize on the same thing when we are creating an image. If we make things in our foreground in the image sharper, more contrasty, and more colorful, and then make something that is in the background less contrasty, softer in focus, and less colorful, we are pretty much achieving the same thing as we would in real life, right? So you're trying to convey depth through that. So this concept of transitions, going from sharp to soft, cool to warm, saturated to desaturated, dark to bright, is how we convey that feeling of depth. So let's take a look at this scene, right? And what are we doing here? First of all, we are using leading lines. This was taken on a hike in Glacier National Park in Montana. And on this particular day, actually, there was intermittent snowfall, there was intermittent rain. So the storms were coming and clearing, and most interesting conditions to take a landscape photograph. So we started hiking up the mountain, and this is the Grinnell Glacier hike. And so we were going up this mountain, and it was raining intermittently. And we came upon this scene that was off to the side of a mountain. So I had to scramble down the path away from the main trail to get to this view. But I liked this a lot because, one, there was a dead branch that was pointing to what I want the viewer to look at. These leading lines on the rock covered with moss also do the same. So we had nice, strong leading lines pointing towards the mountain, which is the main subject in the photograph. And when the storm cleared and the mountain revealed itself is when this picture was made. And it was nice to have a little bit of sunlight breaking through and coming. So you can see how the sharpness, the color, the texture, everything is accentuated in the foreground, right? So the trees sharper, the rocks are sharper, the rocks have more color on them, and you know, they are a little bit bright and warm. Why? Because I'm trying to achieve that feeling of depth. And when you look at the mountain, it is not as sharp in focus, right? And it is not as colorful as what we are seeing in the foreground. So by doing that, you're basically telling the viewer, hey, this is what is close, that is what is far, and that feeling of depth is how that feeling of depth is achieved. I hope that makes sense when you look at this image. So when people say, you know, I have it tack sharp from front to back, every pixel in my frame is super sharp, that might work for something like if you're taking portrait of an animal maybe, but it doesn't work in nature photographs, because in nature photographs, you're not trying to convey the anatomy of something, you're actually trying to convey a feeling. And that feeling will come when we have incorporated that 3D effect into the image, because basically the viewer must feel like they are stepping into the scene. And how will they feel that if they don't have a 3D feel to the image, right? So having that concept of depth is very, very important to enhancing the emotional impact of the image and making the viewer feel that they're actually stepping into the scene themselves. moving on. In each of these instances, I'm going to try to move this a little bit off screen. So in each of these instances, what I'm trying to do is, okay, that might be better. What I'm trying to do is show depth. The first image was taken while hiking well above the Tiger Nest Monastery in Bhutan. It's called the Boomdrak Trail, excuse me. So we had gone into the mountains above Tiger Nest Monastery, hiked up for a couple of days, camped over there. And then we were hiking down to the Tiger Nest Monastery. And on the way, we came across this forest. This was not even a photography trip, but it was a family vacation, but I had the camera with me and was glad I did, because what an incredible scene. I had no way of knowing that you would have these flowers blooming in the middle of the forest, and then I would have 3 trees and then 3 in the middle ground and 3 trees in the background, just perfectly aligned. Just got super lucky. The second image is from the Dolomiti, again, while hiking in the Dolomites in Italy. The storm was coming and going, and we were hiking in the rain and came across these wildflowers blooming in the meadows, and the mountain intermittently showing itself. And the last image is from Bali, Indonesia. And I loved how the fern added that element of depth, because it's such a strong foreground element and it leads you into the scene, and the waterfall is in the background, right? So notice how in each of these images, that feeling of depth is being conveyed specifically by applying the principles of using color, contrast, focus, brightness, right? The things that our eyes pick up on, and saying, I'm going to make what's in the foreground much more accentuated and make what's in the background more faded, and thereby convey that feeling of depth. So hopefully this makes sense. Okay. All right. So I don't know if it will let me move it again, but okay. All right. So isolating visual elements. Okay. So, oftentimes people ask me, but Sapna, how do you know what the picture is about, right? So you walk into a scene, lots of action drama going on. This is beautiful fall foliage in Utah. The mountains have this gorgeous blue shade. And, at periods of angled light, sunrise or sunset, the colors are absolutely glorious. And then you ask yourself, but where is the picture? What am I supposed to shoot? Because if we don't have a strong focal point, we end up with what looks like a postcard. Anybody with an iPhone or any smartphone for that matter, or point and shoot camera can take it out and take a postcard, right? If you're standing in front of a beautiful scene, you take it out and you take a picture. How are we as nature photographers going to rise above that crowd and say, no, I'm going to be able to isolate a visual element. I'm going to be able to convey depth. I'm going to create emotional impact. We are taking photography to a next level. How can we do that? Well, we need to be more keen in our observation. So we're not going to take postcards, but we're going to go beyond the postcard. And in order to do that, we have to not only convey depth, like I showed you earlier, we also need to start isolating our visual elements. Remember, I said the photograph is like a drama, right? It's a visual story, a visual play. And in that drama, we're going to have some main characters. We're going to have supporting characters. Who is the main character in this story? Is there any doubt? No, because the way that strip of light, there were clouds in the sky and they parted and sunlight fell off all trees on just one tree. That tree at that moment becomes the main character. So light in a landscape will determine who the main character in our visual story is. And this will change because at this moment, this light is lit. 5 minutes later, some other tree will be lit. 5 minutes later, light might be on the mountain. So the light determines who the visual, which is the main visual element and which is the point of maximal impact, which we also call the focal point. And you can translate that to say that is the main character of my story. So we can use light to isolate visual elements. What else can we use? Atmospheric conditions. So this was also taken at Glacier National Park. It so happened that in the background, you can see that a snowstorm is approaching, a blizzard is coming. And this is a small aspen grove with a few leaves still remaining, right? And these leaves are going to be shed when that storm hits these trees. But for a few transient moments, sunlight hit it before the storm hit. And that was the moment to take this picture, because the glorious yellow color of the aspen leaves can be portrayed against the backdrop of an approaching storm. Now imagine if I did not have the storm coming, then the mountains would be dark, right? They wouldn't be bright like they are here. They wouldn't be faded out. It would be a dark, contrasty picture. And maybe the light wouldn't fall on the leaves as well. So then it would be difficult to say, this is my main character. This aspen grove is my main character. I can't tell you that because there is no stage light. Think of it that way, right? I'm not isolating the visual elements from each other. Having that storm, having that snow squall come in, created an atmospheric layer of separation, thereby making it possible for these trees to take a center stage. So it's important to understand that there are certain conditions in nature, whether it's light or whether it's atmosphere, that will come through and will give us enough visual separation between the different elements so that we can make the story about something. So the more we practice looking at nature with that eye, the easier it becomes to create images like that. Okay. So looks like somebody is upset about something there. Okay, so let's contrast that with something here, right? This, you could say this is also a good picture, but when you look at it, your eye keeps traveling around the frame. I'll try to speak a little bit louder so you can hear. So your eye keeps traveling around the frame here, and it is a little bit difficult to identify where your main visual element is, right? If you close your eyes and then you open it and you say, I'm going to ask myself where my eye goes, it becomes difficult to identify one visual element as opposed to something like this. But say, look at a picture like this, okay? Let me move this again. Okay. Is there any doubt in our mind as to what the strong visual element is here? No, it's very clear, right? So this was, again, during the pandemic. You know, we were very, very busy in the hospital, and it was just a never-ending stream of patients, both with COVID and also taking care of patients who did not have COVID. So from February to about almost to September, it was a tough period. You know, we were at the peak of the pandemic. This was in 2020. And finally, in October, when I got the chance to take vacation for a few days, I just wanted to go away and not be with anyone, just wanted to be alone in the middle of nature and take that time to recover from, you know, all of the stress and anxiety that the pandemic had caused. And so I chose to go to Utah and photograph the fall colors. I went to Utah thinking, you know, there'll be glorious fall foliage and that is what I want to photograph. But when I got there, the subject that appealed to me most was this dead tree. Because somehow, and I'll talk more about this later on, but it taught me that there is beauty in suffering. You know, in the right light, every subject looks beautiful. It's just the perspective that we need, you know, whether it's suffering, whether it's pain, whatever it may be that comes at us in life. I think it is our attitude of how we perceive it and how we receive it that determines the beauty of that moment. And so it was a very poignant image for me, and it's one that has resonated very deeply with majority of my audience on all social media platforms, because I think they understood what the visual story was that I was trying to convey. So let's move on. Again, using light here for separation as well as color, right? To have something that is devoid of color makes that visual element stand out even more. So paying attention to that. Okay, there are two approaches we could take for something like this. The image on the right, again, is a story that is about the fog bow or the rainbow and the layers of mountains and the tree. So that's one story. On the left side, we have a stronger main character. Now there is no doubt, oh, this is a story about the tree. Everything else is the supporting cast, those layers of mountains, the grass in the foreground, those are just supporting characters, but this is about the tree itself. So I think when you approach the scene, ask yourself, what is it that I'm attracted to most in the scene? And try to make the story about that. And then it's important what you exclude, because what you include and what you exclude are both equally important because you're directing the viewer's eye. Oftentimes, people think only about what they are including and forget to think about what they do need to exclude, which are the distractions that need to be removed. Moving on. Okay, so we talked about enhancing visual impact, right? Create a strong emotional response by enhancing visual impact. We talked about how to add depth to an image. We talked about how to isolate visual elements. Now I want to talk about another concept, which is more difficult to understand. And this might be very tough for somebody who's just stepping into photography, but I know that many of you here have pursued photography for several years. And so I think it's important to bring up this concept of visual tension. This doesn't apply just to nature photographs. This applies to any images. In fact, everything that I have spoken about today does not apply just to nature photography, but to any image that you want to make strong emotional impact with. What is visual tension? Remember I said the visual story is like a drama, right? And the focal points are the main characters in our story. By that token, if we extend that further, think of visual tension as the dialogue that takes place between the main characters in the story, right? So in order for us to enact a drama, we have to have a dialogue between the main characters. So that is visual tension. In other words, the most interesting elements in the image, the focal points, what is the relationship they have with each other? What is the dialogue that's going on between them? So for example, what are the main visual elements here? We have water in the foreground reflecting the clouds above. This was taken at Yosemite. What you're seeing in the background is the half dome. And this, I drove up here during a winter storm, some of the best times to photograph Yosemite. Very rare to have this much snow in the valley nowadays, especially with global warming. We have very few days now. We get to see this. 10 years ago, this used to be the norm. We used to have several weeks of snowfall in the valley. We don't have that anymore. And, the rain, it depends on rainfall and snowfall. So anyway, here in this image, you're seeing that your eye gets attracted to the foreground because there's water with reflections and these soft mounds of snow-covered grass. And then in the background, of course, your eye is going to get led to the point of brightness. And the brightness is next to the half dome. So that structure will attract your attention. So what is happening is your eye is bouncing back and forth between half dome and the sun behind it, and then coming to the foreground. And the dialogue between these two visual elements is what is creating the visual tension. So let me illustrate that a little bit more. Believe it or not, the geometry of a scene also has an impact on the emotional response of the viewer. Subconsciously, you do not realize this, but actually lines that are going from bottom left to top right have an uplifting, adventurous, positive feeling, like energy, feeling of energy. And lines that come from top left to bottom right tend to be more muted, soft, harmonious, calming effect. So when we are framing a scene, if we incorporate lines that go bottom left to top right, you can assume it will be a more energetic scene. And if we incorporate lines that are coming top left to bottom right, like in this scene, they tend to be more calming. we cannot control the lines in nature, right? They are what they are. I mean, sand dunes will be the way they are. But if the purpose behind your photograph is to generate a soothing image, not an energetic one, then you will seek out the dunes that have those lines, that has the geometry and symmetry to create the visual response that you are looking for. This concept is a little bit difficult to grasp, but it will come with practice. Using geometry to modulate the emotional response is one of the many things we can do. So let me just flip this image, okay? What happened here is I just took that image we had earlier. That was this is Death Valley in California. And basically this was in the moonlight long after the crowds have dissipated, the heat has gone down. It's just a couple that are hiking up this dune. If you take this image where the line is going from bottom left to top right, it's more of an energy feeling conveyed, of adventure, right? And excitement. And believe it or not, going back to this one, if we have a line that's coming down, it tends to be more soothing. You might have to flip back and forth several times and pay a little bit of close attention to it in order to understand that. In the first glance, it will feel like, I don't know what she's talking about. But I think with as you do it more and more, you'll understand why geometry has a role in emotional impact.
This image, madam.
And this was published by National Geographic, and it was a assignment on minimalism. So basically, National Geographic runs these competitions where it will ask you to submit for their assignments. And it was an assignment on minimalism. And I felt like, once the sun went down and the heat dissipated and the crowds disappeared, it somehow, that sand brought a lot more minimalism with it. And, having a soft moonlight only and nobody else there but this couple, I felt was a very minimalistic scene. And it was well received and it won the competition. And so it was published by Nat Geo. And it's also one of my favorite images because it really helped me understand how geometry has an impact on the visual emotional response of the viewer. Right, so this is a good one.
Doctor.
Yeah.
That is earlier one. That is a mesmerizing image. Just it can't go out of my mind, that picture.
Thank you. Thank you. Now this is one that is, I think, much more easier to understand in terms of visual tension. What did I say earlier? I said visual tension is the dialogue we have between the main visual elements in our frame. What are the main visual elements here? We have the tree, obviously, right? Our eye is going to look at the tree. Why? Because the colors are very bright, right? We have this red foliage, which attracts our attention. So we're going to look at the tree. Then I also said we look at points of brightness. So we're going to look at the bird. Remember, the things that our eyes are drawn to are brightness, color, contrast, and texture, right? So here, there is no doubt in our mind, when we look at this image, we say, hey, there are two main characters on stage here. One is the tree and one is the bird. Now let's talk about the concept of visual tension. What did I say? I said that the dialogue that occurs between the main characters in the play is visual tension. So the fact that the bird is looking at the tree, the beak is pointing to the tree, right? So you look at the bird and your eyes automatically will follow the line of sight of the bird and it will go to the tree. You look at the tree and the branches of the tree are the leading lines that lead you back to the bird. So in having this particular arrangement, we are forcing the viewer to have the eye travel from the tree to the bird, from the bird to the tree. And in doing so, the person is emotionally invested. The longer a person spends looking at your image, the greater the emotional impact the image will have on them. This also won some competition, outdoor photographer or something like that, something, I forget. Anyway, now imagine this is not something I can control, right? The branches of the tree could be pointing to the left, the bird could be looking to the right. Now think about that for a second. If the branches of the tree were pointing to the left and the bird was looking at the right, and we had a big negative space in the middle, would these two main characters work for us? No, because there is no dialogue happening between the two main visual elements. That is the concept of visual tension. It is not enough to identify what is it that is the focal point in an image. It is also equally important to identify what are the supporting characters. Is there another focal point that is important? What is the relationship of one focal point to the other focal point? How is the geometry of the scene playing out? So you see, it's a very intricate visual analysis that goes far beyond what somebody who is not, who is just taking a picture with an, iPhone to document an experience is doing. Here we are modulating the visual response of the viewer with deliberate steps at every level. And because we know that a dialogue between the focal elements is important, we're going to wait for that bird to turn and look at the tree before we take the picture. Because if the bird is not looking at the tree, there is no picture to be had. So I think just being aware of all of these elements when we are out in nature, then we are ready to observe and ready to use all of that knowledge we have. So hope that makes sense. Again, here, let's talk a little bit more about visual tension. Remember, I said lines that go from bottom left to top right will be energetic, uplifting, adventurous. It is no accident I wanted to incorporate that tree on the bottom left. Why? Because the leading lines are leading towards the mountain. I want you to look at the mountain, right? Now notice how that feeling of depth is being conveyed through the scene. I deliberately burned what is in the foreground, made it darker, more colorful, more textured, more focused. And what is in the background? Brighter. Why? Because I want your eye to travel there. And I want the viewer to get that concept of depth coming through, but at the same time also understand now there is a triangular visual tension going on. You have the tree looking at the mountain, and below that you have the lake. So in that triangle, your eye will keep traveling. And one of the ways to learn how visual tension works would be like close your eyes, open them, and consciously follow the path of your eye through the frame. Do this with any of your pictures, right? So if your eye follows a certain pathway, and that is the pathway you want the viewer to take, then you're set. You have created an image that is very successful. But if you open your eyes and your eye is darting all over the place and you don't know what to look at and there is no strong visual pathway, then no, we have not reached our end result. So the post-processing, one of the primary things, people think, oh, photoshopping is bad because they're thinking that they might be thinking, I don't know what they're thinking, but I'm assuming they're thinking that we made some errors in the field and we're trying to correct those errors in the field by fixing them in Photoshop. No, that is not what we are doing. What we are doing in post-processing is shaping the visual pathway to modulate the emotional response of the viewer, because you want to take it above the postcard. You don't want it to be just a postcard. You want it to be something better. So you're going to dodge, you're going to burn, you're going to accentuate color, you're going to increase texture by sharpening a little, you're going to add autumn effect and soften something in the background. Why? Because you're trying to add depth and create a 3D scene. And believe me, it takes a lot of skill to do this and still maintain the realistic nature of the mountains. For those people who say post-processing is bad, let me ask you something. Have you ever used a wide-angle lens? If you have, then you will understand that when you look at a mountain, you see it at a certain size. You slap on the wide-angle lens, and all of a sudden, the mountain looks much smaller, right? Suppose you take that picture and then you post it saying straight from camera, like you're very proud of it. What have you achieved? You basically have taken what was a natural scene, distorted it with your wide-angle lens, made the mountain appear smaller, made it unrealistic, threw it out there and said, look, I'm proud of the fact I have distorted reality. How can that be a good thing? How can you not post-process that image, right? How can we not correct the fault that was of our wide-angle lens? We use the wide-angle lens basically because we want to captivate people with what's in the foreground, make it appear big, good. but we don't want to lose significance for what is in the background. So we might have to do a focal length blend. We might have to do something to bring back the same significance that we saw with our naked eye for the background. So post-processing is, to me, as important, if not more important, than what you do in the field. And by not post-processing your images, you're not doing justice. You're not doing justice to your skill. You're not doing justice to your images or your photography. And I would love to hear your thoughts on it and how you feel about that.
Doctor, somebody asked, yes, what is the EXIF of that image?
Yeah. So what I would say is, for all of these images that I'm showing, they're all on my Flickr string.
Okay.
And on Flickr, every one of them has detailed EXIF data. Okay. So I would encourage you to go look it up, any image that you like. They're all on Flickr. Please go and, the detailed EXIF data, date taken, everything is there.
Yes.
What lens was used, what settings were used, everything is there.
Okay.
Okay, so
somebody is saying, please. See, there are many people are appreciating a mesmerizing, enthralling. Somebody is saying class. Just by reading that class, they might be referring, it is very high class. But what I feel, apart from you being a radiologist and a photographer, you are also a very good teacher.
Yeah. I think I love to teach. Yeah, thank you. I actually, one of the main reasons why I do workshops, it's not for, it's because I enjoy teaching. It is actually a lot of effort, right, to set up the workshops and to spend time in the field. And it is 1 week of concentrated learning, and every shot my clients are taking, and I'm standing next to them and guiding them and adjusting and understanding the principles behind how that image is being made. But in doing so, I think every time we teach someone, it forces us to learn more, because you can't teach something unless you learn more. Yeah. So one of the reasons why I force myself to teach is because my students will ask questions which I don't know the answers to. And so my students teach me as much as I teach them. And I think it's a positive experience overall. So yeah, really enjoy teaching, both in medicine and in photography. I like it. Okay, so we talked about adding depth to an image. We talked about isolating visual elements. We talked about visual tension in depth. And the last point I want to talk about is creating mystery. And here, what I want to say is, whenever you throw something out there that people have to scratch their head a little bit and say, wow, how did she do that? How did that happen? Immediately, the viewer has to spend a little bit more time analyzing the image. And every nanosecond that the viewer spends analyzing an image, greater the chance of an emotional impact. So instead of just making something, mundane, why don't you make it more magical by creating a little bit of mystery? So like, for example, here, I deliberately hid the light source. Obviously, this is a backlit wave, but when you hide the light source, it creates a little bit of mystery, because the person is saying, wow, this looks just like a shell, right? I had to wait and take multiple pictures before I found a wave that was shaped exactly like a seashell, and it's on the ocean. So, it's a deeper story. Think of it as like visual poetry, right? If you just write words and sentences that are not poetic, it's not as enjoyable as an actual poem. So I think our photographs should be like visual poems and have a little bit of mystery to it as well, which makes the viewer, pause, think, reflect, analyze, and say, aha, I get it now. Okay, so this was taken in Alaska. And basically, I was on a boat and circumventing glaciers, icebergs. This was in Glacier Bay. We were circumventing icebergs. And I noticed that this foreground iceberg was framing the background iceberg very nicely. Yes. Had to do 3 rounds around the icebergs to get like the right perspective, because they're moving, they're floating, right? These gigantic icebergs are also floating. We are floating on a boat. So I had to wait for that right arrangement to come together in order to get this image. But I like it because it conveys a frozen wave, right? And it makes people think, what is this story about? Like, what is this thing? And till you explain and say, oh, it's an iceberg, and there's a foreground iceberg and a background iceberg, it makes somebody stop, ponder, think. So they're enamored by the color and the texture, but at the same time, the subject itself is kind of mysterious. So that's try to create images that have some mystery in them. Of course, abstract images like the one you see on the right. This is just minerals that have changed the color of the soil. And then look at the water, it has carved out like canyons, and rivers have flown through and changed the geometry of the scene. I think our planet is just insanely beautiful when it comes to the natural beauty that we are blessed with. And I think keeping our eyes open for places that have this kind of beauty just helps us appreciate it more, and also to be able to share it with others. I just want the one image on the left. This was actually taken with an iPhone, and I went to Yosemite after a snowstorm, and I wanted to see what I should make a picture of. So oftentimes I'll take out my phone, and before I set up my gear, I'll take out my phone and I'll be like scouting the scene and taking pictures with it, seeing how if there is something I could work with. So I took this shot, and then there are obviously no ice caves in Yosemite. So this, if I can explain this image a little bit, this is actually a reflection. So those mountains you're seeing are actually a reflection in the water. And then the top is actually the river bank that is covered with snow.
Oh.
And then the thin crust of ice is coming, right? So I took the picture and I flipped it. So it looks like you're looking at mountains through a cave, but actually I'm standing at the river bank and the mountains are at my feet. Okay. So people who looked at this and who knew Yosemite knew there was no ice cave there. So when I label it Yosemite, they're like, wait a minute, how did she get this picture? And they remember the mountains. They're very popular mountains, right? And they recognize the architecture of the mountains right away. And they go, how did she get this? And then they laugh, just like Narayanji laughed now, because that revelation comes and says, so that's what you did, right? So you basically create a strong emotional response because you made the viewer pause, think, reflect, and then have that aha moment. So something like that, that's creative. And this obviously, Apple bought the picture because it was taken on an iPhone. They put it on their platform, and you can see this is probably one of the most liked images. Makes me wonder why I spend all that money on all that gear, right? When you can take a picture like this with an iPhone, but you know the answer to that. We do so many other things with our gear, which we cannot do with an iPhone. But anyway, they found its target audience. There were people who had an iPhone, they saw the picture and they're like, oh my God, I could take a picture like that too. And so let's go on. The very last point I want to make is about metaphorical images. What that means is it is not a picture of something, but it is a picture about something. What do I mean by that? For example, this is actually inside of a canyon. This is a slot canyon. And I wanted to make the picture about how water, when it flows through the canyon, erodes the rock, right? And so it basically creates these beautiful textures and lines. The geometry is very pleasing, but more importantly, this is a picture about water itself, the shaping character of water itself, how even though water is so flexible, it can erode rock and it can set its imprint on rock. And so I found that, how can something so flexible also be so strong over time? So it just tells you persistence is key here, right? And the water just persisted and persisted till it left its imprint on the rock. And I loved how it made it look like waves. So it's a picture about something rather than just a picture of rocks. Again, remember this picture was about hope, the sentiment of hope. It is not a picture of just a forest. It is not a picture of just the redwood trees. It is a picture of the sentiment of hope. It hangs in multiple medical centers, especially in cancer centers, when people are receiving treatment and they look at this and they feel like even in the darkest of moments, the rays of hope can touch you. and can bring about some kind of mental peace, right? So it's an image about something. Again, this is an image about change. So you could say, oh, it's just a bunch of trees. No, it is the fact that there's a storm approaching, that these leaves are going to be shed, that it is a transient moment of glory. The only thing permanent in life is change, right? So it is a picture again about something. So just like poetry will need some kind of unraveling for us to understand, what is the sentiment behind it. Emotional imagery also will have a deeper meaning than what you're just seeing. It's not just the visual element, but then you need to delve into it deeper and ask yourself, why did the photographer take this picture? What is the story that they're trying to tell us with the picture? And when you understand that deeper connection, that is the true appreciation of the art. Again, here, this was about suffering, about death, and yet how much beauty there is even in that pain and suffering taken during the period of the pandemic. This had profound meaning for me. It made me realize that no matter how sad or how painful something may be, that is still a part of life, and that is still a beautiful part of life. Suffering doesn't have to be ugly. It is just a part of life, and we have to accept it just like we accept joy. And in doing so is how we find balance in life. So there is beauty even in suffering. And in this one, I'll have to move this so you can see the bottom here. So basically here, I wanted to convey a story of how we are such a tiny part of this cosmos, right? Like when you compare ourselves to the universe, how tiny are we? And yet how profound an impact we are having on our planet. This is my pitch to all of you, to be aware of what we are doing that is harmful to the planet in terms of global warming, our indiscriminate use of plastics, how we are creating an atmosphere that is self-destructive to us and is also harming our planet immensely. These are huge glaciers that are melting because of our actions. Look at how tiny we are, and look at how big these are, and yet they're crumbling at our feet because of what we have done. And the power we have. A single species is being so harmful to a planet that has innumerable species. And I think that is very, very wrong. And I think each of us, especially as photographers who document the beauty of this planet, have an important role to play in nature conservation and climate education. Moving on, this is again waves of sand, again image about how sand is shifting, time is changing. So look for the deeper meanings. And I would like to leave you with this quote which says a photograph is usually looked at and seldom looked into. So the next time you look at something, ask yourself, what is the deeper meaning the photographer is trying to convey to me? And then I wanted all of you to find your moments of Zen or flow and know that finding flow is like a meditative phase when you're shooting, right? You forget everything else. You forget the pain of the past. You forget the anxiety of the future. You forget any other stresses you may have. And you're lost in photography. You're keenly aware of what is in the present only. But lost in flow doesn't mean you don't realize there is a bear approaching. That is not finding flow means. Finding flow means you're keenly aware of every soft footfall around you. You're just in the present. And here I would have to say the poor photographer is so lost in using both of his cameras and all of his lenses that he's not really finding flow. He's lost in struggling with his camera gear. He's not in a meditative state where an aesthetic image could be generated, because if he was, then he would be noticing every dewdrop on every grass blade. That is how keenly aware you become when you are in a state of meditation. You are not removing yourself from nature. You're becoming one with nature, which means you will understand and embrace everything that is happening around you in that particular moment. And I wish each and every one of you those meditative moments when you can truly connect with nature to create images that heal you as well as those who will view them. I think that brings us to the end. Excuse me, feel free to reach out to me on any of my social media platforms. I am on Facebook, Instagram, Flickr. Email is docreddy@yahoo.com, so it's pretty easy. You can also go to my website, which will list all of these contact links. I love to hear from you guys. I love to get feedback, love to get questions, and love to answer them. So please feel free to reach out at any time. If you're unable to catch my attention with your questions during this presentation, you can always reach out through the other means. I will be happy to answer them for you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point and take any questions you have.
Yes, that's a very good presentation. Your photographs were speaking themselves, and your talk was such that, see, just hearing and seeing your picture, I lost my words. I was so engraved into it. Really, really beautiful. Actually, I was not only very much impressed by your photographs earlier, but by listening to you, it is really enlightening. And as some of the viewers said, certain viewers said, it is enlightening not only to the beginners, but to the seniors also. And
Thank you.
Members, anybody having the questions, please ask.
Yes, I have some questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sapna. I'm Ashwini from Mumbai. I have some questions. See, because most of these pictures you shot in the very cold climate. So, like, how you got acclimatized, and you didn't face any issue of equipment malfunctioning, and what about the battery consumption in the cold climate? Did you face any battery issues?
Thanks for the question, Ashwini. So basically, I have shot in -32-degree weather. I'm talking Fahrenheit. And so sub-zero temperatures, and my cameras worked fine. Both Nikon and Sony were fine, actually, even at that sub-zero temperature. Battery does drain quicker, but then I carry like 3 or 4 extra batteries anyway in my backpack, so I just switch it out. The latest Sony, though, I use the A7R3 and A7R4 now, and I'm amazed at the battery life. Easily go through an entire photo shoot without any problem in terms of having to switch out the battery. So I think lately they have become much better. And as far as, I was born and raised in Hyderabad, so I'm not at all used to cold weather. So one of the things that, first of all, I think when I'm shooting, I honestly don't feel anything. People have often said that, their fingers will be going numb, but I don't feel anything because I think mentally I'm in a different state. I am so much in the zone. I don't feel hungry. I don't feel thirsty. I don't feel cold. It's a little bit crazy and it's difficult to put into words, but I think when you are lost in something that you're so passionate about, just everything becomes tolerable. It seems like a minor inconvenience, but having said that, I do take the necessary precautions. So I use the Heat Company gloves, which are very, very good. And I use goose down parkas, the Canadian goose down parkas, which are extremely warm. And if I know that I'm going to be out there for a very, very extended period of time, I'm actually a wimp and have invested in the past in battery operated jackets which heat me. So my core is kept warm. Over the years, I have gotten used to the cold, so I don't use the battery operated jackets or gloves anymore. But there was a point where I even have Bluetooth operated heating soles for the shoes because of how cold it was. But over time, I have gotten used to it. And now the gear I have, I feel is good enough. So I just layer up. I have a fleece layer. Then I have, so I use smart wool. So I have like an inner smart wool thermal. Then I have a fleece layer on top of it. Then I have my thin goose down jacket. And then I wear my goose down parka. So with those 4 layers, it's plenty warm. And usually for the legs, I'll have a thermal lining and then have some sort of a warm snowboarders kind of pant, the winter pants. So that also helps. And I think just like you said, acclimatizing yourself to it, knowing that it's going to be cold and just accepting it. You're not out there for picnic It's not going to be comfortable, but you do need to have your hands functional. You can't get frostbite, and you can't have them turn numb because you have to operate the camera. So it's very, very important to keep the core warm so that blood will circulate to the periphery and your hands will receive enough blood so they don't turn, they don't become numb. If the core gets cold, then your extremities will very quickly get cold. People make the mistake of like wearing a lot of gloves but not keeping the core warm. Very important to keep the core warm because that's where the blood is coming from. So
Ravi Shankar?
Yeah, Dr. Sapna, I have one question. Some of photograph of yours looking like aerial photographs, means taken now from certain height. Have you ever used the drone photography to click some these landscaping shots?
No, I don't. I suck at. Okay, so I finally bought a drone just a few weeks ago, but haven't used it yet. I bought it mainly because when my husband comes with me, I wanted him to have a toy to play with. So I give him the drone and I say, you can play with the drone, and then I'm taking my pictures. And he's gotten good at shooting with the drone. But all the pictures that you see that look like they're aerials, they are places I've hiked to, that have gone up. I've walked up there. So it's none of them are aerial. All of them are just, with my regular camera. I'm just at a higher vantage point because I walked up there. I hope to get better with the drone because I think having that aerial perspective would be awesome, especially I have, I'm going to Iceland in November with a workshop, and I'm sure there'll be others there who'll be bringing their drones. So it would be nice to have that expertise as well to guide them in terms of compositions. So hope to get that under my belt soon. But so far, I have not used the drone. The more gear I have, first of all, it's more stuff to carry. And then secondly, I think the more gear we have, the less artistic we become, because we are focusing on putting this lens, putting that lens, adjusting this parameter, adjusting that parameter. So the technical side of our brain starts to take dominance, and then the artistic side sort of takes a backseat. I don't like that. I like to keep the gear as minimalistic as possible so that the artistic expression can happen. In fact, I don't even want to think about my gear. I want it right now. My camera and my lenses are like the extension of my hand. I make adjustments at a subconscious level, and I would like to keep it that way. And that has been my reluctance to learning how to fly a drone, because I know then I have to think about the technical aspects. I don't enjoy the technical aspects. Yeah, I mean, I have to be good at them, but I would rather focus on the artistic side of things. So.
Yogesh ji.
Good evening, madam. So I have two questions actually. So how often do you breach rules of composition in landscape photography? And second question is, what predominant editing technique you use for dodging and burning?
So is this Yogesh who's talking?
Yes, this is Yogesh.
Okay, so Yogesh, let me ask you, what rules? There are no rules.
Right. Because I have seen in your image that you have placed element of interest is placed in dead center. That's why I asked you.
Yes. So basically, I think the rules shouldn't be called rules. They should be called guidelines, right? So when you're just starting out in photography and you have no idea how to achieve balance or how to attract the viewer's eye, then I think those guidelines help, whether it's the rule of thirds or, so I think you can use it as guidelines initially, but beyond that, I think it's useless. So I don't necessarily think about rules per se. Maybe like over time, I have when I look at my images, I know that I use the rule of thirds quite a bit without realizing it. Maybe because just the way I place things. But I think it's totally okay, to not break, to not follow the rules or guidelines, as long as the end result is working. But if you say, I'm not going to pay attention to the guidelines and then end up with an image that is not aesthetically strong, then we're not doing a favor to ourselves or to the audience, right? So I think it has to be addressed on a case-by-case basis and see when it would be applicable to really construct a composition based on the guidelines. Like I use leading lines all the time, I use triangles all the time, and I use the rule of thirds all the time. But I wouldn't hesitate to put a subject smack dab in the middle, like that tree that you saw lit with, you know, whether it was a dead tree or whether it was the other tree where the light was just hitting it, right? And that scene, I want you to showcase the tree right in the middle. I don't want it off the side. It was center stage. It was the main character, and all the others were supporting characters. So for me, that visual story worked. I think you have to ask yourself when it's okay to step out of the box and actually be original and unique and creative in that way. The second part of your question, can you repeat what the second part was?
What predominant technique you use for dodging and burning?
Dodging and burning. So I tend to use luminosity masks. So as opposed to, you know, addressing all shadows or addressing all light, I will actually create masks based on luminosity. I use the Raya Pro software to do that. You could use Tony Kuiper's software to do that. And Sean Bagshaw has a very detailed tutorial series on how to use luminosity masks if you needed to learn that. But Raya Pro is also very intuitive. And Jimmy McIntyre does a very easy and simple job of teaching you how to use luminosity masks. And what we're doing with that, dodging and burning, is basically shaping the visual pathway, right? So not all shadows in our composition are going to be treated the same way. Certain shadows may need to be deeper based on where they are with relation to our visual pathway, and some others may not need to be as dark. Same thing with light. Some areas of light may need to be brighter because we want the visual viewer's eye to travel there, and others may not be as bright, right? So I don't make global changes. I actually make very local changes, all with the idea of shaping that visual pathway. So I use luminosity masks primarily, and two, I use light painting techniques. What is that? That is where I will actually paint in soft light, not just dodging and burning in the conventional sense, but actually select the same color of light as there is on, say, a mountain, and then paint with it so that light becomes a little bit brighter, but the quality of light is maintained exactly the same in terms of luminosity. It will go up, but in terms of color and quality, it will remain the same. So yeah, between soft light, and sometimes I'll apply a radial filter coming off of the side in Camera Raw, because with the radial filter, you can let the light filter on down to the scene. For example, like in that wave picture, if we have the sun on the top right frame and the light is coming down from that area, then I can put a radial filter there, increase the exposure and let the light stream down onto the scene from that light source. So that's usually how I do it. I don't create fake light usually. You know, I know that that's like a very trendy thing to do with some of the nature photographers, but I like to take whatever light there actually is in the scene and accentuate it, make it more dramatic, rather than try to throw light where there is no light at all. I don't do that.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you. Any more questions, please? Sapna, madam, you are almost speaking to about 1 hour, about 90 minutes, about 100, more than 100 minutes now.
Oh, wow.
आपने बोला था कि मैं 40 मिनट से जास्ती कॉन्सेंट्रेट नहीं कर सकती हूँ, लेकिन आपने 100 मिनट से जास्ती अच्छा प्रेजेंटेशन किया।
पता नहीं कितने लोगों को सुला दिया, लेकिन बात करते करते
अभी मैं जितना लोगों को देख रहा हूँ, जितना लोग बैठे हैं, they are all I know most of all these people, सब लोग बहुत सीरियस एंड वेरी गुड फोटोग्राफर्स, वो जिनका एक्चुअली इंटरेस्ट है वो लोग है, कुछ ऐसे 10-15 लोग छोड़ के गए हैं, बट I am really happy that very serious and interesting photographers are there. अच्छा है, very good.
अगर कोई हिंदी में पूछना चाहे तो
नहीं तो बंद करें.
We didn't get any questions in Hindi.
हाँ, ऐसा सी ये अभी इसमें हिंदी में पूछने के लिए देर इज नो स्कोप ना, चैट में अगर पूछने का तो लोग ऐसे पूछते हैं, एंड मैं खुद भी है ना इंग्लिश से जास्ती हिंदी प्रेफर करता हूँ. इंग्लिश तो संभाल लेते हैं, लेकिन आई एम नॉट वेरी गुड इन इंग्लिश, so I take advantage, हिंदी बोल देता हूँ.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for
हाँ जी,
your patience.
हरि भाई, Hari Mahidar is one of our past president, senior industrial photographer, मुंबई के बहुत नामचीन फोटोग्राफर है. हरि भाई, please.
I like the presentation very much. Beautiful, excellent. Full.
Thank you.
10%, 10 to 10 mark.
Thank you.
Very good, very good. Loved that show.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my name is Subramanian. Actually, your presentation was excellent, par excellence, and more than your pictures, the storytelling was quite impressive.
Yes.
I mean, hats off, and wonderful pictures, wonderful narration or storytelling. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Evening
sir.
well spent. For you, it's a morning. And I just wanted to know which part of California you are in?
Bay Area.
Bay Area. Okay. I visit Sacramento. My co-brother is there in Folsom, so I keep visiting US at least once in 2 years. Next time when we are there, we'll meet you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you. And Prachi, thanks for taking all those notes. I hope they help. I saw your thing. I hope they are helpful. And I think this is recorded, right? So they can listen to it again. Sometimes I think some concepts are difficult to grasp. Yeah.
Yes. Then,
I would like to say something.
Yeah.
Yes,
Hello?
please.
Yeah. Actually, I don't have a question, but what I appreciate is that most of the training goes around exposure and composition and all these things, but you are concentrating on the inner perception and actually what your soul does when you're taking a photograph. And that teaching is very lacking, and that your presentation is fulfilling that vacuum. So I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank
Aniruddha,
you.
because I think in terms of gear, right, it's very easy to become an expert in handling your gear. It only takes like a week. Honestly, it'll only take a week for you to learn how to use your camera if you put in the hours. So it's just a matter of practice. If you're shooting every day for a week, you'll know how to use the camera. Slapping on a lens and is very easy. I feel that, people spend inordinate amounts of time trying to analyze where the sharpest point of focus is for their lens and, what kind of metering they should use and all of that. But in doing so, what you're doing is taking away the artistic side of things. And ultimately, we have to remember, we are not engineers, we're artists. And if you want to create art, you have to let the aesthetic, artistic side of the brain come through. So the more time you spend on your gear and on its settings and on how to use it and all of that, the less you will have to spend on the aesthetic aspects and the artistic aspects. And even if you are just starting out in photography, it's equally important to acquire that aesthetic aspect right off the bat. From the very beginning, you have to start looking at the compositions, start understanding focal elements, start understanding visual tension. All these principles need to come in. Because if we don't do that, and then we teach people how to use the gear, then we shove the principles of, the rules of composition on them, then you are basically not giving that emotional energy to the person or the understanding to even, when they say your images look so different from others, why is that? Because that concept has to be introduced at the very beginning. And if you don't do that, then you will never have impactful images, no matter how good you are. Like that quote I showed you by Elliot Irving, which said that all the technical expertise in the world will be useless if you do not have a basic understanding of the artistic aspects. So I think I specifically don't focus on rules of composition because there are 250 million YouTube videos on that. I don't focus on gear because you could go to Sony and pull up anything you want and get gear. Nobody talks about what I talked about as much. And that is the part that actually takes photographers to the next level, understanding that deeper meaning in the images. that part. So I'm glad you mentioned that is missing. Yes, I agree completely. It's missing, and that's what I try to instill in my clients when they come for the workshops too. Because all the other part is easy to learn, but this part, the ability to see and the ability to render in such a way that you make others see is rare. So thank you.
Actually, have you thought of writing about this, a book?
Yeah, eventually.
It will help a lot of people.
Yeah, I know. I think, I'm sure I have to write at some point, and I, enjoy teaching, so I'll write it. But now that I have actually reached quite a few people with this presentation, because it was given at the Outsiders Conference, and then I gave it again for B&H, the camera store in New York, and it will be on their YouTube channel. And now the Indian audience has also heard it. So, and then I think in future, I want to do like a full series and address like more things along these lines. And hopefully at some point, maybe after 5 years or something, I can write a book.
Thank you.
We'll see.
डॉक्टर, हम लोग कभी एक नेक्स्ट सेकंड सेशन करेंगे एट योर कन्वीनियंस.
Sure.
यस. तो अभी बहुत से लोग मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि ये जो रिकॉर्डिंग एक बार देखेंगे ना लोग, नेक्स्ट इसके लिए और
Yeah, and we can do image critique भी कर सकते हैं, जहाँ पे आपके फोटोग्राफ्स देख सकते हैं और पूछ सकते हैं कि क्या अच्छा है, क्या बुरा है.
Yes.
अलग तरह से क्या कर सकते थे, like sometimes possible होता है और sometimes नहीं. तो देखते हैं क्या होता है.
Yes. मैं देखा आपका जो है ना, ये चीजों में आपका ये जो रिव्यू करने का, जो इसके बारे में जो ऑब्जर्वेशन बोलने का है, ये जो है, यू आर वेरी कीन ऑन दैट. आपने पहले भी बोला थे सर, तो बहुत अच्छा है. ये ऐसा किसी जो मतलब जस्ट ये जो नॉर्मल लेवल से ऊपर उठ के जो फोटोग्राफी को देखते हैं, ऐसे बहुत कम लोग हैं. So you are one such person, and willingly you are sharing your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you.
और किसी को कुछ बोलना है? नहीं तो डॉक्टर जी, वहाँ पे डॉक्टर जी ने मॉर्निंग 6 o'clock को शुरू किया प्रेजेंटेशन. Now you will be around 8 o'clock. आपका पूरा दिन होगा अभी. You will be busy.
Hello, Naren ji.
Yeah, actually.
हाँ जी.
हेलो नारायण जी.
हाँ जी.
मैडम का प्रेजेंटेशन बहुत ही अच्छा, रियली नेचर टू नेचर. मैडम के पास नेचुरली अच्छा है, तो नेचर ही अच्छा लगा हमको. लेकिन मैडम मैनेज कैसे करती है फोटोग्राफी, डॉक्टर और हाउस कीपिंग सब?
Yeah, I'm seeing a question here that says somebody is a beginner and they did not want to ask questions about EXIF, so I think when you're just starting out, I think it's very important to understand EXIF. If you don't know, then how will you set your camera? So totally okay to ask for EXIF questions when you're a beginner. But if you've been shooting for 6 months, then after 6 months, you should not be asking for EXIF. If you're asking for EXIF after shooting for 6 months, then there is a fundamental lack of knowledge that needs to be filled. There is a gap in the learning that needs to be filled. For example, there are 250 different ways of shooting a waterfall. You could change the EXIF in terms of shutter speed, change the EXIF depending on so many parameters, right? Your ISO, whatever you want to change. So at some point you must say, okay, for every waterfall, I can shoot it at like 1/10 of a second, maybe, because I like the texture of the water at that point. And then adjust your ISO to achieve the 1/10 of a second, if the shutter speed is important for you. If you say, I don't like noise, I like shooting everything at 100 ISO, okay? So then you put it at 100 ISO and say, I'm going to adjust my other parameters in terms of my aperture in order to get that kind of exposure. So I think the first 6 months should be spent in mastering whatever EXIF principles you have to understand, basic concepts of exposure and aperture and stuff like that. But once you get past the 6 months, you should not have to ask for EXIF for anything. You must have the ability to use anything that's presented to you and create the appropriate exposure. For that, I encourage people to just look at the histogram, learn how to read the histogram. At the end of the day, all you're trying to do is have a decent exposure, right? Not to blow your highlights or burn your shadows. As long as you have a decent exposure, the rest of it you can adjust in terms of bringing back details. So EXIF becomes less important after the first 6 months. If you're still asking for EXIF after 6 months, then please go back and learn the fundamentals of exposure, because having that strong foundation is absolutely key to progressing in photography. If we have that gap in knowledge, then it will be very difficult to go on. So yeah, don't ever hesitate to ask me for EXIF. I'll be more than happy to share. You know, some people hide the EXIF on Flickr, which I have never understood. Like, why would you want to hide your camera settings? Like, what is that? I never understood the logic in it. So everything is open for everybody to see, and understand that a lot of times the images are not single shots. For me, I will do focal length blends. You know, I might be doing focus stacking to get more stuff into focus. I might be doing exposure blending. So it's not one EXIF data won't help. And also, irrespective of how detailed the EXIF data might be, unless you're standing at the same waterfall with the same quality of light, it's useless for you, right? So at the end of the day, you're like, okay, 1/5 to 1/10 of a second, good for a waterfall exposure. That's the only pearl of wisdom you earn from that EXIF. And you know, maybe night photography will become more important because yeah, you're at a higher ISO and you're like, oh, I don't know, can I go to f2.8 to get, you know, the shot of the Milky Way, stuff like that. But there are no silly questions really. So please don't hesitate. And if you ever ask a question and somebody tells you that's a silly question, it is not you who are silly. It is the person who's telling you it's a silly question who's the silly one, because there are no silly questions, and nobody should be belittled because they are trying to seek knowledge. If somebody talks down to you when you are trying to seek knowledge, then it reflects the poor character of the person who's talking down to you, not you. So please don't feel hurt or intimidated to ask at any point. You can ask anybody anything, because you are trying to gain knowledge, and that is always a good thing. And if they can't answer in a polite fashion, it's on them, not on you. So please don't feel that. I think.
Thank you. Thank you. That is
I think that's it. Just making sure
that is all, I think.
Yeah, just be persistent, keep doing it, and you know, you'll get there. It's just practice. Practice makes perfect. And I know it's really difficult with the pandemic. All of us are going through a very tough time. Most of us are cooped in, you know, the uncertainty, the lack of income, so many things affecting us. But I think it's even more important to pursue our art at this time because it helps us heal. And, you know, it's more important to find those moments of Zen and meditation where we can lose ourselves behind the camera. And that helps us to become emotionally resilient. So wish you all best of luck with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely presentation, Dr. Sapna.
And namaste to all.
Namaste. And आप यूएसए में होते भी आप इधर पूरा भारत में ऐसा हम लोग ऐसे ही लगा कि आप यही हम लोग के आसपास ही है। Thank you.
हर 3 महीने तो आती ही रहती हूँ। अब ये पैंडेमिक हुआ है तो आना मुश्किल हो रहा है, बट अदरवाइज हर 3 महीने आती हूँ मैं इंडिया।
पैंडेमिक के बाद कभी मुंबई में आता है तो you can visit our PSI also.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. It will be nice to give a talk in person. Meet each and every one of you.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
कभी कोइंसिडेंट होता है तो कभी नॉर्मली हम लोग PSI का जो एनुअल एग्जीबिशन मतलब सैलून जो होता है एवरी ईयर नॉर्मली जनवरी में होता है जहांगीर आर्ट गैलरी में, मुंबई का लीडिंग आर्ट गैलरी है। ऑलमोस्ट एवरी ईयर वी हैव ए फोटोग्राफी एग्जीबिशन देयर, नेशनल और इंटरनेशनल। ओके, थैंक यू, थैंक यू।
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
I will send the recording to you.
Okay.
And this will also be uploaded on our Facebook page, Photography Society Facebook page. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Recording stopped.